The courtroom was packed, wall to wall. The air inside was thick, not just with humidity, but with tension, judgment, and the sharp buzz of whispers barely held back. Rows of polished benches creaked under the weight of folded arms and furrowed brows. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance, each second louder than the last. Zora Williams sat still, her feet not quite touching the floor. She was small for 10, all knees, eyes, and tight curls pulled into a too-high puff by a pink scrunchie that had seen better days. Her dress was simple, navy with little white polka dots. One of the shoulders had slipped slightly, revealing a tiny scrape from climbing the fence behind her apartment complex 2 days ago. She held a notebook tightly to her chest. The Justice Journal, hand-scrawled on the cover in glitter pen. Inside were the answers no one seemed to want. At the front of the room, a lawyer droned on. Something about negligence, standard protocol, intent. Words that felt big enough to crush people. The kind of words that, once spoken in a courtroom like this, stuck to your name forever, especially if your name was Tanya Williams, and you were a black woman with no connections, no savings, and no more second chances. Tanya sat next to her public defender, lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands, once gentle and sure when wrapping bandages or braiding Zora's hair, now trembled under the table. She didn't look at Zora. Couldn't. Judge Holloway sat at the bench, high above them all, gavel resting like a sleeping animal beside his hand. He was the kind of man whose very presence made people sit up straighter. Stern face. Gray suit. A reputation for being, by the book. And this book? It didn't often favor people like Tanya. A cold wind rattled the old courthouse windows. The prosecutor, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, voice smooth like a newscaster. "Let's not pretend this is more complicated than it is. A patient died. A nurse made a mistake. That mistake has a name, and it's Tanya Williams." There was a murmur. Someone gasped. Tanya flinched. Zora's fingers tightened around her notebook. She looked around the courtroom. No one saw what she saw. No one listened the way she did. No one cared that the timeline didn't make sense. That the medicine the patient supposedly received didn't match the record she'd read in the files she wasn't supposed to touch. That the security footage from that night had a gap. No one cared that her mom had warned another nurse about the dosage hours before the incident. Her heart pounded. She looked down at her shoes. Then at her mom. Then at the judge. They say children should be seen and not heard. But what if being seen wasn't enough? What if silence was more dangerous than speaking? She stood up. At first, no one noticed. She was just a little girl in a sea of suits and solemn faces. But then her chair scraped backward with a screech that cut through the courtroom like a blade. Heads turned. A bailiff took a step forward. The judge's brow lifted. "Sit down, young lady," someone whispered harshly. But she didn't. Her voice trembled, but the words came out clear. She didn't lie. Silence. A courtroom built for order and control suddenly felt like the edge of chaos. 1,000 unspoken rules shattered in one moment. The judge's gavel didn't fall. His hand hovered over it, frozen. Who is this child?" the prosecutor asked, startled, his voice cracking just slightly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "She's my daughter," Tanya said quietly, finally turning. Her eyes were wide with disbelief and fear. Zora clutched her notebook tighter. Her lips trembled, but she didn't look away. "I know what happened that night," she said. "I wrote it down. I saw it. I heard things. I read the chart. The numbers don't add up." "Young lady, this is not the place for," Judge Holloway started, but stopped. He studied her. Something in her eyes, not defiance, not disrespect, but conviction. She took a breath. Her voice broke a little. My mom's telling the truth. You just don't want to hear it. The room was still. Even the jury, instructed not to react, couldn't help but lean forward. Judge Holloway removed his glasses. Rubbed the bridge of his nose. Looked at Tanya, then at Zora, then at the notebook clutched in her arms. What's in that book? He asked, voice low. Zora hesitated. Everything. Bring it to me. There was a stir. The bailiff hesitated, unsure what protocol covered this. Zora stepped forward. Each footstep echoed louder than it should have. She held the notebook out with both hands. Judge Holloway didn't open it right away. He just stared at the sparkly cover. At the messy handwriting. At the girl who'd broken the rules, not out of disrespect, but out of desperate, innocent hope. I'm calling a recess, he said suddenly. 15 minutes. Gavel struck. The sound was final, like thunder. The courtroom exploded with murmurs. Tanya turned to her daughter, tears springing to her eyes. Zora, why would you do that? Zora looked up at her. Her eyes were red, but unblinking. Because you needed someone to say it. And nobody else would. Outside the courtroom, people began pulling out their phones. Some whispered about the little girl with the notebook. A camera crew in the hallway perked up. Something had shifted. Not just in the case. In the air. In the story. In the hearts of those watching. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? 3 weeks earlier. South Side, Chicago. The scent of lemon-scented floor cleaner and fried bologna floated through the cracked window of apartment 3B. A train screeched by in the distance, its metal grind mixing with the soft hum of a box fan balanced on a milk crate. Inside, Zora sat cross-legged on the living room floor, pencil in one hand, her Justice Journal spread out in front of her like a sacred text. She was working on a new page titled, The Truth is Bigger Than Adults. Mom always says grown-ups know best, she muttered aloud, writing in quick, slanted print. But grown-ups also mess up. A lot. And sometimes they lie. But the truth doesn't. Zora underlined the last sentence 3 times, then doodled a tiny pair of scales beside it. Not because she was artistic, but because it felt official, like something that might be carved into the side of a courthouse. From the kitchen, her mother's voice floated in. Zora, baby, your sandwich is getting cold. I'm working on something. Zora called back, eyes still locked on her page. Tanya appeared a moment later, holding a paper plate with 2 halves of a grilled cheese, cut diagonally the way Zora liked. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and the circles under her eyes were darker than usual. But she smiled anyway, that soft, tired smile Zora had seen 1,000 times. I know justice is important, Counselor Williams, Tanya said, placing the plate down, but you also need fuel. Zora grinned. Even Supreme Court justices eat lunch. That's what I'm saying. Tanya plopped onto the couch, kicked off her nursing shoes, and exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Zora watched her. Her mother was everything to her, part superhero, part warrior, part bedtime story queen. She worked long shifts at the county hospital, often overnight, and still made time to read to Zora, braid her hair, and quiz her on spelling words. She didn't cry easily. She didn't complain. She just kept moving. But lately, there were cracks in the armor. Zora saw the way Tanya double-checked her paycheck, the way she whispered on the phone with Auntie Nia about bills. She noticed the way her mom stared at the ceiling at night, eyes open, like she was waiting for something bad to fall through. And then it did. It started with a patient. A white man in his late 40s, admitted for a standard outpatient procedure. Nothing complicated. Nothing high risk. But he died. And the blame came fast. Tanya's name was suddenly on the chart. Her signature, or something that looked like it, next to a dosage that didn't make sense. An accusation from another nurse. An internal report. Suspension. Then arrest. Zora remembered the day the police knocked on their door. The badge. The tightness in her mom's jaw. The way Tanya had turned and whispered, "Go to your room, baby," even as the officers told her she was under investigation. Zora hadn't listened. She watched through the crack of her bedroom door. Watched her mother get cuffed, led down the hallway in front of neighbors who peeked through their curtains like it was a show. Watched someone she loved be reduced to a suspect in seconds. And something inside her cracked, too. At school, the whispers started. Her mom killed somebody. She's gonna go to jail forever. I heard they found poison. Zora kept her head down. Said nothing. Wrote everything. At night, she couldn't sleep. She'd sneak into her mom's room, now empty, and sit on the edge of the bed, holding one of Tanya's old work badges like a worry stone. She'd read through the hospital papers her mom had left on the desk, trying to make sense of the numbers, the codes, the abbreviations. Eventually, Uncle Darnell came to stay with her. He was her mom's younger brother, a former Marine who moved like a man used to watching his back. He didn't talk much, but he made sure she ate and got to school. He let her keep the Justice Journal on the kitchen table, even when he needed space for his laptop or beer. One night, as Zora sat writing at the table, Darnell pulled up a chair. "You're always scribbling in that thing," he said. "What you writing about?" Zora looked up. "Truth." He raised an eyebrow. "Truth? Stuff they're not listening to in court. Stuff that doesn't make sense." Darnell exhaled slowly, like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. "You're 10, Zora." "I'm 10.5. He nodded. "Right. But the world doesn't care about halves. Or truth, most days." She looked him dead in the eye. "Then why do people get up every day and go to court and wear suits and say they care?" For a second, he didn't answer. Then he said something that stuck with her. "Sometimes, you say the truth not 'cause people are listening. You say it so you don't forget who you are." Zora began reading everything she could get her hands on. Books about law. Cases where people were falsely accused. The Miranda rights. Due process. Chain of custody. She didn't always understand the words, but she understood the feeling, that something was wrong, and no one was stopping to see it. She wrote timelines. Question lists. Even tried to mimic her mom's signature to compare it with the one in the report. They didn't match. She showed her findings to her mom's public defender. He smiled kindly, patted her head, and said, "That's very sweet, Zora." She hated that. Sweet. Like her thoughts were a cookie. Like she was a baby with crayons instead of a girl with facts. So she kept writing. And waiting. And when the court date finally came, she asked to go. Everyone said no. But she showed up anyway. Because the truth needed a witness. And her mom needed someone who remembered who she was before they tried to erase her. The news broke quietly at first, a few lines in a local paper, nothing big. Just another hospital investigation, just another name under a headline. But to Tanya Williams, it was the start of everything unraveling. It started with a death. Then a mistake. Then a target. The hospital had to explain how a healthy, middle-aged patient named Gregory Monroe had gone from routine post-op to body bag in less than 8 hours. The administration called it a procedural anomaly. But the press needed a face. The public needed someone to blame. And Tanya? She was a black nurse working the night shift. Alone. By the end of the week, she wasn't Tanya the nurse anymore. She was Tanya the suspect. Zora watched the transformation happen like slow-motion wreckage. First, her mom was pulled off the schedule, pending investigation, they said. Then came the meetings with administrators, union reps, and eventually lawyers. Each one chipping away at her spirit, like waves against a rock. The allegations started small. Tanya failed to log medication properly. Then they got worse. Tanya administered the wrong drug. Then worse still, Tanya ignored vital signs, or didn't follow protocol, or maybe, just maybe, had a motive. What kind of motive? Tanya had asked her lawyer, jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Zora saw it all. The long silences at the dinner table. The way Tanya flinched when the phone rang. The way she stopped wearing her badge around the house. Worse than that was the way people changed around them. Their neighbor, Ms. Richardson, who used to bring over peach cobbler on Sundays, now avoided eye contact in the hallway. The kids at school stopped inviting Zora to group projects. Even their church, where Tanya had volunteered for 6 years, suddenly had no room on the prayer list. You know how people get when bad things happen, Uncle Darnell said one night. They don't want to catch it. Like it's contagious. Zora stared at her spaghetti, untouched. But she didn't do anything. Doesn't matter, he said, quietly. Truth takes longer to catch up than fear. Then came the betrayal. A nurse named Karen Bailey, who used to carpool with Tanya on Thursdays, gave a statement to the hospital. She said Tanya looked tired and distracted that night. That she'd mentioned being overwhelmed. That maybe Tanya mixed up the meds. It wasn't fact. It wasn't proof. But it was enough. Enough to convince the hospital to fire Tanya. Enough for prosecutors to open a formal criminal case. Enough for the local news to print, negligent nurse under investigation in patient death. Zora saw her mother read that headline at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She just folded the paper carefully, like it was something sacred, and slid it into the trash. That night, Tanya finally spoke the thing Zora had feared most. I might have to take a deal. Zora looked up from her notebook. A deal? If I plead guilty, they'll go lighter. Probation. No jail time. Maybe just a fine. But you didn't do it, Zora whispered. Tanya sighed. Baby, sometimes it doesn't matter. Zora stood up so fast her chair screeched. Yes it does. It matters to me. Tanya reached for her, but Zora stepped back. You always said truth is the one thing no one can take from you, she said, voice shaking. But they are taking it. And you're letting them. Tanya's eyes filled for the first time. She looked so tired, not physically, but deep-soul tired. Like hope had been something she borrowed on credit and the bill had finally come due. I can't protect you if I'm in prison, Zora, she said softly. You can't protect me if you disappear, Zora shot back. They didn't speak for the rest of the night. A week later, Tanya was indicted. Felony charge, criminal negligence causing death. Court date set. Bail posted. Tanya came home, but she was quieter now. Smaller. The only time Zora saw any fire return was when she pulled out an old photo album. It was late. They were supposed to be sleeping. But Tanya opened the album anyway, the one with the frayed edges and yellowed pages. She flipped to a photo of herself in scrubs, holding a newborn Zora in her arms. I used to think I'd change the world, she whispered. That helping people would be enough. Zora crawled into bed beside her, resting her head on Tanya's shoulder. You did help people, she said. Not enough, Tanya replied. Not when they look at me and don't see a nurse or a mother. Just a black woman who's easy to blame. Zora didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around her mom's waist and held on like the world was trying to pull them apart. From that night on, Zora knew two things. 1, the system wasn't built to listen to people like her mom. 2, someone had to make it listen. She wasn't strong. She wasn't tall. She wasn't loud. But she had eyes. She had ears. And she had her justice journal. If no one else was going to fight for her mother, she would. Even if it meant standing up alone. Even if it meant saying the words out loud when everyone else wanted her to stay quiet. Zora never meant to become a detective. She didn't wake up one morning thinking, today, I'm going to uncover inconsistencies in a wrongful prosecution and save my mom from a felony conviction. She just wanted her family back. She wanted her mom to hum in the kitchen again. She wanted to walk into school without hearing whispers. And most of all, she wanted someone, anyone, to believe her mother. So she started looking. Not because she thought she could fix everything, but because no one else was even trying. It started with the patient file. Her mom had always been organized. After her suspension, Tanya brought home a manila folder with her case notes and printed versions of her work logs from the night of the incident. She kept it hidden inside the drawer of a chipped cabinet in the hallway, second from the top, behind old tax papers and expired coupons. Zora found it 2 days after Tanya's indictment, while looking for Scotch tape. She sat cross-legged on the hallway rug, folder open, her justice journal nearby. Her eyes scanned the printouts, timestamps, dosages, initials. Something jumped out. 10:42 p.m. lorazepam, 1 mg, administered by T.W. 10:45 p.m. vitals checked, Nurse Bailey. Zora squinted. Wait. She flipped through the next page and checked the summary timeline. Mom gave meds at 10:42. Nurse Bailey checked vitals 3 minutes later. But the autopsy listed cause of death as cardiac arrest due to overdose at approximately 11:05 p.m. Zora's heart pounded. Then why didn't anyone say anything at the time? She wrote in her notebook. Balance scale vitals normal at 10:45, patient not in distress. Balance scale overdose by 11:05, what happened in between? Balance scale who was in the room during that time? She circled that last question 10 times. Later that week, Zora followed Uncle Darnell on a trip to Tanya's public defender's office. While Darnell argued about incompetence and lack of urgency, Zora wandered to the far side of the waiting room and pressed her ear against the conference room wall. She heard snippets. No solid witnesses. Jury won't care about a timing discrepancy. We have to prepare for worst case. Zora's chest tightened. They were giving up. They weren't even asking the questions she was. On the ride home, she turned to Darnell. What does burden of proof mean? He blinked. Why you asking that? I read it. On one of the reports. It said, burden of proof lies with the prosecution. What does it mean? Darnell scratched his beard. It means they have to prove your mom did something wrong. It's not her job to prove she didn't. Zora frowned. But if no one's proving she didn't, then how do they know she did? He looked at her sideways, thoughtful. That, he muttered, is a damn good question. Zora's school life had become a silent war. Kids stared. Teachers whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. Even Ms. Carpenter, her favorite English teacher, had pulled her aside one day and said, if you ever want to talk to someone about, what's going on, my door's open. Zora nodded politely, but inside, she was screaming, I don't want to talk. I want someone to listen. So she started talking to her notebook instead. Why does the security footage skip from 10:58 to 11:12? Why did Nurse Bailey say Mom looked distracted when everyone was overworked that night? Why did no one ask why the dosage log was handwritten instead of scanned? She started writing down names. Schedules. Patterns. She didn't have all the information, but she had enough to know things weren't right. And more than that, she knew her mother. Tanya didn't rush. She didn't guess. She didn't forget to chart. She was the kind of nurse who triple-checked every syringe, who stayed late to calm scared patients, who brought extra snacks in her locker for the overnight shift. If anyone was tired that night, it wasn't from negligence. It was from caring too much. One afternoon, Zora stayed late after school to use the library's computer. She looked up every article about her mom's case, most of them riddled with bias, nurse accused in fatal error, or did fatigue lead to tragedy? She also searched the name Gregory Monroe, the patient. Turns out, he wasn't just a patient. He was the brother-in-law of one of the hospital's senior board members. Zora sat back, blinking at the screen. Oh. She added another note to her journal. Balance scale possible pressure from hospital to find a scapegoat equals mom. Her stomach churned. The pieces didn't all fit yet, but the picture was forming. It looked like fear. It looked like politics. And it looked like injustice. That night, she asked Darnell, "Do you think adults get scared to tell the truth?" He was washing dishes. He paused, suds up to his wrists. "All the time," he said. "Even in court. Especially in court." Zora thought about that for a while. Then she whispered, "What if I'm not scared?" He turned around, his expression softening. "Then you're braver than most grown folks I know." Zora couldn't sleep. Not because of nightmares, but because her brain wouldn't stop spinning. She climbed out of bed and padded quietly into her mom's room. Tanya was asleep, one arm over her eyes, the other resting across her stomach. The stress had aged her. Her face, even in rest, looked like it was still fighting. Zora knelt beside the bed and whispered, "I believe you." She pulled her justice journal from her pocket, opened to a fresh page, and wrote the only thing that mattered. "I don't care if I'm just a kid. I see you. And I'm not giving up." The courtroom felt colder the day the trial began. It wasn't just the air conditioning humming through the vents or the stone-gray walls that made the place feel sterile. It was something else, something deeper. Like the whole room was waiting to swallow someone whole. Zora sat in the back row, feet not quite touching the floor, wearing her best outfit, a pale yellow cardigan and jeans with one tiny embroidered star on the cuff. Her justice journal was tucked into her backpack, zipped up tight, but always within reach, like armor. Next to her sat Uncle Darnell, arms crossed, eyes sharp beneath his army vet cap. He hadn't spoken much since they entered the courthouse. Neither had Zora. They both knew, this wasn't just about law. It was about survival. When Tanya entered the room in handcuffs, Zora had to bite the inside of her cheek to stay silent. The sound of the metal was subtle, but somehow louder than everything else in the room. Tanya kept her head up, her back straight, but Zora saw it. The fear in her eyes. The silent scream she kept buried just behind her ribcage. The bailiff led Tanya to her seat beside the public defender, Mr. Yates, who straightened his tie but couldn't quite meet her gaze. He looked like a man trying to believe in something he'd already given up on. The judge, Theodore Holloway, took his seat next. He adjusted his glasses slowly, methodically, and surveyed the room like it belonged to him. Zora had read about him, tough on crime, big on order. No nonsense. No emotion. Definitely no patience for a little girl with too many questions. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood. Zora stood too, but inside she felt like she was sinking. The prosecution wasted no time. District Attorney Cole, tall, tan, and polished like a politician, addressed the jury with the calm confidence of a man who had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is not a complicated case. A patient died. A nurse was careless. And now, someone must be held accountable." He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "Let me be clear, this is not about malice. This is about negligence. This is about a system that only works when the people inside it do their jobs properly." And that night, Tanya Williams did not. Zora felt her stomach twist. Mr. Yates barely looked up when he gave his opening. "My client is innocent," he said plainly. "There are inconsistencies in the evidence that the state would rather ignore. But we believe those inconsistencies matter. And we will prove that Tanya Williams was not the cause of this man's death." Short. Weak. Safe. Zora glanced down at her notebook and scribbled. "Balance scale. If you don't speak like you believe it, no one else will either." The first witnesses were quick and forgettable. A hospital administrator. A chart auditor. A medical examiner who said words like hypoxia and toxicity like he was reading from a grocery list. Then came Karen Bailey. Zora recognized her immediately. She was pretty, blonde, and wearing the kind of fitted blazer that made people lean in. She stepped into the witness box like she was on a stage. "Do you recognize the defendant, Ms. Bailey?" D.A. Cole asked. "Yes," she said, glancing at Tanya with carefully controlled pity. "We worked together for almost 3 years. And on the night of October 8th, you were both assigned to the overnight shift in the cardiac unit?" "Yes." "What did you observe about Nurse Williams that night?" Karen paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough to let the silence do some of the damage. She seemed distracted. Stressed. Not her usual self. Zora could feel her throat tightening. She wanted to scream. Distracted? She hadn't even spoken to her that night. She said so herself in the report. But no one was stopping her. "Did you witness her administer any medications?" Cole asked. "No," Karen replied smoothly. "But the logs show her initials. The dosage was incorrect. That can't be disputed." Zora's nails dug into her palms. Yes, it could. She had the copies. She had compared the handwriting. It was close, but not exact. But the jury didn't have those pages. No one had asked. Mr. Yates finally stood. "Ms. Bailey, were you present in the room during the time of the medication error?" "No, I was checking on another patient." "So you're basing your testimony on second-hand information?" "I'm stating my professional observations." Zora rolled her eyes so hard it hurt. "Observations," she whispered to herself. "More like assumptions." Darnell leaned over and muttered, "Keep it cool, Zoe." "I am cool," she whispered back, though her legs were shaking. As the day wore on, Tanya never looked back at them. She kept her eyes forward, focused, determined not to show weakness. But Zora knew the expression. It was the one she wore when she had a migraine but still showed up to work. When she hid pain behind pride. By the time the court adjourned for the day, Zora felt like she'd run a marathon without moving. Outside, reporters waited like vultures. "Ms. Williams, did you cause the death of Gregory Monroe? Any comment about the allegations?" Zora gripped her backpack straps tighter. Darnell shoved through the crowd like a linebacker, shielding Zora with his broad back. "No comment," he barked. They made it to the parking lot. Tanya's eyes met Zora's for a second before she was ushered into a separate car. There were 1,000 things Zora wanted to say. But all she could manage was a nod. That night, back at the apartment, Zora pulled out her justice journal and flipped to a clean page. She drew 3 overlapping circles. Truth, system, fear. In the middle, she wrote. Where people give up. And below that, in capital letters. I won't. She stared at the words for a long time. Then she flipped to the back of the notebook where she'd written her biggest question yet. What if the medication was never given? She didn't have the answer. Not yet. But the question itself felt like a match. And soon, she'd be ready to light the whole room. Zora had watched a lot of detective shows. Enough to know that in every mystery, there was always one moment when everything cracked open. One detail nobody else saw. One truth hiding in plain sight. She just didn't think she would be the one to find it. It was 2 days into the trial when Zora decided to do something reckless. After school, instead of going home, she walked straight to the hospital. She didn't ask permission. She didn't tell Darnell. She just marched through the sliding glass doors of St. Vincent's Medical Center, heart pounding, fists tight around her backpack straps. No one stopped her. Hospitals were busy places. People in scrubs and name tags rushed past, not even glancing at a small girl in a cardigan. To them, Zora was just background noise. And that was her greatest advantage. She'd memorized the floor plan. Cardiac unit, 5th floor. Nurses' station just outside room 514, the room where Gregory Monroe had died. The hallway was quieter than she expected. The soft beeping of heart monitors. The squeak of rubber soles. The smell of antiseptic and lemon floor cleaner. Zora slipped behind a plastic curtain near the supply closet and waited. She counted every breath, every footstep, like she was in a spy movie. Then, when the nurses at the station got up to check a beeping 4 alarm, she moved. Quick. Silent. Heart hammering. She reached the corner workstation. And there it was, the surveillance archive terminal. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe something high-tech with facial recognition or a wall of glowing screens. Instead, it was just a dusty old monitor and a login screen that read. St. Vincent's internal CCTV staff access only. Zora reached into her backpack and pulled out the scrap of paper she'd stolen from Uncle Darnell's kitchen drawer, Karen Bailey's login ID. She'd found it by accident when helping him move some boxes. She memorized it in 10 seconds. She typed it in. And it worked. Her breath caught. The screen changed. Rows of folders appeared, each labeled by date and location. She clicked October 8th. Then, Cardiac Wing, RM 514, Hallway View. A grainy black and white video began to play. For 15 minutes, Zora watched people come and go. 10:30 p.m., a nurse wheeled in a crash cart. 10:42 p.m., her mother entered with a tray of medication. Just like the log said. 10:45 p.m., Karen Bailey passed the doorway, looked in briefly. Then. 10:58 p.m., the screen went black. Zora's eyes widened. The video feed cut out. No static. No error message. Just darkness. It stayed dark for 14 minutes. When it came back, Tanya was no longer in the frame. Someone else walked by, too fast, too blurry to make out clearly. Zora replayed the gap 5 times. Her fingers trembled. She clicked open the metadata log on the side of the screen. 10 hours 58 minutes and 32 seconds, feed lost. 11 hours 12 minutes and 47 seconds, feed resumed. 14 minutes. The same 14 minutes between the time Tanya allegedly administered the meds and the moment Monroe coded. The exact window when the overdose had to have occurred. Zora's voice was barely a whisper. Someone deleted it. She exited out quickly, heart racing, hands sweaty. She closed the terminal, checked behind her shoulder, and practically sprinted back to the elevator. She didn't feel safe again until she reached the sidewalk outside. Then she sat on the curb, notebook in her lap, and scribbled furiously. Balance scale timeline. 10:42, meds given, Mom. 10:45, vitals normal, Karen. 10:58, footage cuts. 11:05, patient dies. 11:12, video resumes. Someone didn't want anyone to see what happened in that 14-minute gap. She looked up at the sky, overcast and threatening rain. It felt like the world was holding its breath. That night, she told Darnell everything. He didn't yell. He didn't say she was reckless or foolish or too young. He just rubbed a hand over his face and muttered, "You really did this?" Zora nodded. I saw it. The camera cuts out at the worst possible time. Like, on purpose. He shook his head slowly. They're not gonna want to hear that from a kid. They don't have to hear it from a kid, she said, voice rising. They just have to see it. Darnell looked at her, eyes unreadable. You think you can get someone to believe you? Zora didn't blink. No. I think I can get them to listen. The next day in court, she brought her notebook. She didn't tell anyone what was inside. Not yet. She just kept it in her lap, fingers brushing the spine, as if drawing courage from the words she'd written. When the judge announced an unscheduled recess due to a witness availability issue, Zora stood. She walked quietly, purposefully, past the rows of wooden benches, toward the front. A bailiff stepped in her path. Sweetheart, you can't be up here. Zora looked up, eyes wide but fierce. I need to speak to the judge. It's about the evidence. I think something's missing. The courtroom stilled. Tanya's head whipped around, eyes wide. The judge leaned forward. Who is this? Darnell stood, voice booming. That's my niece. And if she says she's got something to say, you better let her. The room wasn't silent at first. It buzzed, low, uneasy, as Zora stood just beyond the wooden barrier, clutching her notebook. She barely came up to the waist of the bailiff blocking her way. I said you can't be up here, he repeated. I have evidence, she said again, louder this time. Tanya looked stricken. Zora, baby, go sit back down. But Zora didn't move. Her feet were rooted to the courtroom floor like stone. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. Judge Holloway squinted from the bench. Who is this child and why is she speaking in my courtroom? Darnell stood in the gallery. Your Honor, that's my niece, Zora Williams. The daughter of the defendant. Gasps rippled through the benches. She's 10 years old, the prosecutor scoffed. She shouldn't even be here. I'm 12, Zora corrected. Loud. Clear. And then, without asking, she stepped forward. Straight into the middle of the courtroom. Straight into history. The bailiff reached for her arm. Let her speak, Tanya said quietly. It was the first time her voice had carried all day. Zora stopped just inside the line of polished oak that separated the audience from the trial. Her notebook was tucked to her chest like a shield. Her hair frizzed around her face in soft curls, a few barrettes clinking as she moved. She looked like a child. She spoke like a truth. Your Honor, she said, I watched the hospital footage from October 8th. Judge Holloway's brow lifted. I accessed the camera logs. The hallway feed outside room 514 goes black at 10:58 p.m. and doesn't come back until 11:12. Dead silence. During that time, Zora continued, my mom wasn't in the room. But someone else was. Murmurs erupted. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Miss Williams, are you saying you viewed protected surveillance video? Yes, sir. How? I used Nurse Bailey's login. Louder gasps. Even the prosecutor froze. You hacked into a hospital server? Cole snapped, half in disbelief. Zora shrugged. I used her password. She wrote it down. That's bad security, not hacking. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench. And what exactly did you see? Now, Zora opened her notebook. She flipped to the page, hand steady. And then, with a calmness that sent chills through the courtroom, she said 3 words. Something is missing. The room fell so quiet it felt like all the air had been sucked out. Zora let the words hang. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't yell or cry or plead. She just told the truth. 14 minutes of video, she continued softly. Deleted. Right after my mom left the room. Right before the patient died. That's not a coincidence. That's erasure. Judge Holloway blinked slowly. Prosecutor Cole opened his mouth, then closed it again. In that pause, Zora could feel every eye on her. But none of it mattered. She hadn't come for applause. She came to interrupt a system that only listened to the loud, the powerful, the adult. Tanya couldn't breathe. She stared at her daughter, trembling, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Zora was right. The camera cut. She remembered that Wing had tech issues, but she never thought someone would use it like this. She looked at her lawyer. Mr. Yates had gone pale. He leaned toward the judge. Your Honor, we request immediate access to hospital archives. If surveillance footage was tampered with, that is exculpatory evidence. We need to verify this child's claim, Cole argued. This could be fantasy. Zora didn't flinch. Check the logs, she said, voice steel. The timestamps don't lie. But people do. Judge Holloway stared at Zora like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a child, not as a disruption, but as someone who had changed the temperature of the entire room. He finally exhaled. I'm calling a recess. Bailiff, contact St. Vincent's legal department. I want every second of that video pulled, backed up, and brought here under seal. He looked at Zora. Then he did something no one expected. He nodded. Respectfully. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. A 12-year-old just stalled a felony trial. How did she get access to the footage? Is the DA's office facing misconduct? Did the hospital destroy evidence? Zora stood beside her uncle on the courthouse steps. Microphones were being shoved in her face. She didn't speak. Not until someone asked, "Why did you say those 3 words?" She looked straight at the lens and replied. Because silence is what gets people killed. That night, Tanya held her daughter for the first time in weeks. Zora didn't cry. But Tanya did. You didn't just speak up, she whispered into her daughter's hair. You broke the silence wide open. Zora pulled back and grinned. I told you. I don't give up. It didn't take long for the storm to hit. Less than 24 hours after Zora spoke those 3 words in court, her face was on every local news station. 12-year-old girl disrupts trial with bombshell footage claim. Child hacker or hero? At first, it felt like something out of a superhero movie. Kids at school whispered when she walked by. One teacher asked if she wanted to give a speech in civics class. But the glow didn't last. Not when the system started pushing back. It started with a phone call. Uncle Darnell picked up the landline, yes, he still had one, and muttered a confused, hello. Then his face darkened. What the hell do you mean, she's under investigation? Zora froze on the couch, mid-bite of cereal. They said you accessed confidential hospital data, Darnell told her after slamming the receiver down. They're claiming it could be a felony. Cybercrime. Zora blinked. But I was telling the truth. Darnell sat down, slowly. Doesn't always matter, kid. Especially when you're black. And loud. And right. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry for her. Later that day, a letter arrived. Stamped with the hospital's legal department seal. You are hereby instructed to cease any unauthorized attempts to access or disseminate internal data systems belonging to St. Vincent's Medical Center. Further action may result in legal consequences. Zora held the paper in her hand like it might burn her. I'm 12, she whispered. How can they threaten a kid? Tanya, now released from holding and waiting for the next court session, looked at her daughter with fire in her eyes. They're not just threatening you. They're warning all of us. They're saying, stay in your place. The next blow came from the school. Her principal called her in, stern-faced. We've been contacted by the district. You're not in trouble, she said carefully, but there's concern about your recent actions. Some parents are worried your presence may be disruptive. Disruptive? Like truth was a virus. Zora sat stiffly in the chair and asked, "Am I being suspended?" "No," the principal said. "But we're recommending a few days at home. Just until things cool down." As if she had committed a crime. As if speaking up was something to be punished. That night, Zora lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, arms crossed behind her head. The world felt tilted. Like every time she tried to pull something into the light, someone came running to shut it off. She heard footsteps in the hall. Tanya peeked in, sat beside her on the bed. "They want you to be quiet again," Zora said softly. "I know. But I'm not going to be." Tanya smiled. "That's my girl." She handed Zora a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "An email. From someone named Janice Green. She used to work at the hospital. Says she saw something too. She wants to talk." Zora sat up fast. "A whistleblower?" Tanya raised an eyebrow. "You've really been watching too many legal dramas." But she didn't say no. They met Janice the next evening at a coffee shop off the highway. She wore a hoodie and sunglasses like someone trying not to be seen. "I was a records nurse," she said. "They let me go last year after I flagged some inconsistencies in med logs. It happens more often than people think." Zora leaned forward. "Do you remember anything about Gregory Monroe?" Janice nodded slowly. "I wasn't working that night, but I helped archive his file after. And something was off." She pulled out a USB stick and slid it across the table. "I shouldn't have this. But I couldn't delete it." "What's on it?" Tanya asked. Janice hesitated. "A copy of the original med log. Before someone changed it." Back home, Darnell plugged the drive into his laptop. Zora stood over his shoulder, bouncing on the balls of her feet. There it was. Line by line, patient name, dosage, nurse initials. And then, buried at the bottom, a different set of initials. KB. Karen Bailey. Zora gasped. She gave the med. She logged in. She adjusted the dose. "But, the printed copy showed my mom's initials," Zora whispered. Tanya stared at the screen, mouth open. "Because someone changed it after." Darnell leaned back, arms crossed. "We take this to court." "But they'll say it's fake," Tanya said. "Or inadmissible." Zora opened her notebook and wrote one word in big, capital letters. Pattern. She flipped back through her notes, scribbled arrows between facts. Janice was fired for flagging inconsistencies. Med logs were changed. Surveillance footage disappeared. Karen Bailey testified under oath, without mentioning she had been in the room. "It's not just one mistake," Zora said. "It's a cover-up. And we're about to pull it apart." The next morning, Tanya's lawyer called. "Something's changed," he said, voice tight. "The judge wants a closed-door review of all electronic evidence. Now." Zora could feel the shift. The system had tried to silence her. Now, it had no choice but to listen. Zora had never felt this way before. As they walked through the corridors of the courthouse, her heart was beating faster than usual. The weight of her thoughts seemed heavier. The last few days had felt like a rush of information, of discoveries, of threats. It wasn't just the hospital that had something to hide, it was the whole system. It was everywhere, tangled in the courtrooms, the investigations, and the people who claimed to uphold justice. Tanya could feel it, too. She hadn't been sleeping much, and it showed. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but her determination burned bright. They had just finished their conversation with Janice Green, the woman who had worked as a records nurse at St. Vincent's Medical Center. She had been fired for questioning the discrepancies in the medical records, but it was clear, she hadn't been silenced. Not completely. But what would Janice's testimony truly mean? What could one whistleblower do when the whole system seemed to be built on lies? The coffee shop where they met Janice had been quiet, almost too quiet. It wasn't the kind of place one would choose for a clandestine meeting, but perhaps that's what made it safer. Janice had insisted on being discreet, her hoodie pulled up and her eyes constantly scanning the room for any unwanted attention. She had been in hiding for months, ever since her firing from St. Vincent's. "I wasn't supposed to talk about this," Janice had said in a low voice, "but when I saw that footage, when I saw your daughter stand up like that, I realized that I couldn't stay silent anymore. People are going to get hurt." Her eyes had looked haunted, almost lost. "You were the one who flagged the discrepancies?" Zora had asked. Janice nodded slowly. "I flagged it. The dosage, the timing, the signatures, everything was off. I tried to tell someone higher up, but they brushed me off. The head of records, Karen Bailey, she was always one step ahead. She knew how to cover her tracks." "Karen Bailey?" Tanya had repeated, leaning in closer. "The nurse?" Janice's eyes darted to the door nervously. "She's not just a nurse. She's part of something bigger. She knows how to make things disappear. Files, records, even people." Now, sitting in the courthouse waiting area, Zora clenched her fists. Her mind raced. There was something about Karen Bailey that didn't sit right. The way she had testified in court, so calm, so sure of herself, made Zora feel uneasy. People like that didn't just know how to manipulate the truth, they believed in their lies. Suddenly, Tanya's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and then looked up at Zora, her face pale. "It's the lawyer. He says they're moving up the review today." "What does that mean?" Zora asked, her voice trembling. "It means they're going to see all the evidence." "All of it," Tanya said, holding the phone with a firm grip. "They're going to see the real truth." Zora swallowed hard, a mix of fear and excitement swirling in her chest. She didn't know what to expect next, but she knew one thing for sure, the system was about to break. The courtroom was tense when they arrived. Zora took her seat with Tanya and Darnell in the back. The air smelled sterile, cold and clinical, and the hum of voices seemed to echo off the marble walls. Today was different, though. The weight of the previous days had shifted. The silence in the room felt charged, like something was about to crack wide open. Judge Holloway entered, his robe trailing behind him as he took his seat. He looked down at the assembled parties, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, Cole, was already seated, his face tense as if he had just swallowed something bitter. On the other side, Mr. Yates, Tanya's lawyer, stood with a folder in hand, his eyes flicking back and forth between the judge and the opposing counsel. "I'm here to review the evidence provided by both parties," Judge Holloway announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. "We will proceed with the closed-door review. No one except for the attorneys and the court staff is allowed inside." Tanya turned to Zora. "This is it." Zora nodded, but her heart was racing. The truth was out there now, hidden in medical records, surveillance footage, and a whistleblower's testimony. But would it be enough? They sat in the waiting room for what felt like hours. Darnell tried to keep up the conversation, but Zora could barely focus. She kept thinking about Janice's words, Karen Bailey. The woman who had erased so much, who had been involved in so many hidden truths. Zora had learned about corruption before, how systems could be rigged, but she had never imagined it could run so deep. What if Karen Bailey was the one pulling the strings? Zora remembered what Janice had said about her, she's part of something bigger. What did that even mean? Who was Karen Bailey working for? And then it hit her like a bolt of lightning. If Karen had been erasing evidence, changing records, lying under oath, someone had to be protecting her. Someone powerful. Her mind started spinning. Who was Karen Bailey working for? And why did they want Gregory Monroe's death to stay a secret? The door to the courtroom finally opened, and Mr. Yates emerged, his face tight. "We're going to court," he said simply. "They've agreed to call in new testimony. But it's not over yet. They're already shifting the narrative." "Shifting the narrative?" Tanya repeated. He nodded gravely. "They're going to claim this was an honest mistake, poor security at the hospital. They'll try to discredit the whistleblower and shift the blame onto Karen's superiors. They want to minimize the damage." Zora's fists clenched. "They want to bury the truth," Tanya whispered. "No," Zora said, her voice firm. "We won't let them." The courtroom was full when they returned. Zora sat up straight, her heart pounding. The judge called for order, and the trial began in earnest. And there, sitting on the witness stand, was Karen Bailey, calm, collected, but with an air of arrogance that made Zora's skin crawl. Karen looked at the jury, her eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. "I did nothing wrong. All of the changes I made to the records were approved. Nothing was deleted. Nothing was hidden." Zora's hand tightened into a fist. She wanted to scream, to stand up and shout, but she didn't. She couldn't. Not yet. But then, a new voice broke through. Janice Green had entered the courtroom. And this time, she wasn't hiding. The courtroom went completely silent when Janice Green stepped inside. It wasn't just the quiet, it was the tension in the air. She wasn't supposed to be here, this wasn't part of the plan. She was just a nurse who had been fired, a whistleblower who had quietly disappeared. But now she was here, standing at the front, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the microphone on the witness stand. Zora couldn't breathe. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. If Janice could hold her ground, if she could give her testimony and expose the corruption that had stained her mother's case, they might just win. But Janice looked different now. There was a hardness in her eyes, a determination Zora had never seen before. She wasn't the woman who had met them in the coffee shop, nervously sliding a USB stick across the table. This was someone ready to tear the walls down. "Ms. Green," the prosecutor said, his voice commanding. "Please state your full name for the record." "Janice Green," she replied, her voice steady but firm. The prosecutor nodded. "Ms. Green, you previously worked at St. Vincent's Medical Center as a records nurse, is that correct?" "Yes," she answered. "For 12 years. And during that time, you had access to patient files, correct?" "I did," she said. "It was part of my job." "And you're here today to testify that you saw something concerning in the records of Gregory Monroe, a patient who passed away in the hospital?" Janice took a deep breath. She glanced briefly at Zora, who was sitting in the back of the room with Tanya and Darnell. She gave her a slight nod, as if saying, "I'm doing this. For you." "Yes," Janice said, her voice stronger now. "I noticed discrepancies in his medical records. The dosage on his prescriptions was altered, and the time logs didn't match up with the nurse's notes." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Zora's stomach twisted. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. Janice continued, each word piercing through the tension like a dagger. "I tried to report it. I flagged the discrepancies. But nothing happened. I was told to let it go. And when I pushed harder, I was fired." The prosecutor nodded, as if this was exactly what he expected to hear. "And who was responsible for overseeing these records?" Janice hesitated for a moment before answering. "Karen Bailey. She was the head of records." Zora's breath hitched. This was the name she had been waiting for, Karen Bailey, the nurse who had signed off on Gregory's death, the one who had appeared so calm in the courtroom when she testified. "Ms. Bailey," the prosecutor said, turning to Karen, "was in charge of the medical records during the time Gregory Monroe was admitted?" "Yes," Janice answered. "She had full access to everything. And she was the one who made the changes. Can you be more specific? The prosecutor pressed. What kind of changes? Janice's voice remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition that once the truth was out, there was no turning back. She glanced toward Karen, who was sitting at the defense table, her posture stiff, her eyes locked onto Janice with cold precision. The dosage of the medication was altered, Janice continued. The logs were modified to show that the correct amount was given, but it wasn't. There were also changes to the time stamps. The medication wasn't administered when it said it was. And the worst part, none of this was ever reported to the family. The room was silent. Even the judge seemed to pause, absorbing the weight of Janice's words. Zora felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was what she had been waiting for. This was the proof. The changes that had been made to Gregory's records weren't just mistakes, they were deliberate. Someone had covered up what had really happened that night. Karen Bailey's expression hadn't changed. She was calm, too calm. Objection, Your Honor, the defense attorney said suddenly. Ms. Green is speculating. She cannot testify about the specific actions of my client without concrete evidence. The judge nodded. Sustained. Ms. Green, please limit your testimony to the facts you have directly observed. Janice nodded. Of course. She glanced down at her hands, then back at the court. But I also saw something else. The morning after Gregory's death, I found a document in the records room. It was a confidential memo, stamped urgent. It was addressed to Karen Bailey. Zora felt her breath catch in her throat. This was new. This was huge. What did the memo say? The prosecutor asked, leaning forward. Janice swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. It was a directive to remove all traces of Gregory Monroe's case from the system. To make sure it was erased. The courtroom gasped. Zora felt the floor shift beneath her feet. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This wasn't just a poor decision made by an overworked nurse. This was a cover-up, planned from the top down. Karen Bailey shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but her face remained unreadable. Zora could see the subtle way her fingers curled into the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She's lying, Karen finally said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. I never received any memo. I've never tampered with any records. The defense attorney stood, glaring at Janice. This is a clear attempt to discredit Ms. Bailey. You have no proof of your accusations. Just more baseless allegations. But Janice stood her ground. The memo exists. I saw it with my own eyes. And I'm not the only one who saw it. She turned to look at Zora, her eyes locking with the young girl's. Karen Bailey didn't just cover up Gregory Monroe's death. She's been covering up for years. Zora's heart raced. The pieces were falling into place. Karen Bailey wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't just a scapegoat for the hospital's failures. She was part of something bigger, a network of people who had been manipulating and hiding the truth for far too long. Zora's mind went back to the whispers she'd heard at school, the conversations in the hallways. She had always felt like there was something wrong with the system. Now she knew what it was. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed. As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the judge raised his hand for silence. Order, he commanded. He looked at Janice. Your testimony has been noted. This case is far from over, but we will recess for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. Janice stood, her face tense but resolute. As she stepped down from the witness stand, Zora's heart swelled with pride. This was the turning point. Karen Bailey might have thought she could control the truth, but now, it was out there. And Zora was determined to make sure it would never be buried again. The courtroom was still buzzing with the aftermath of Janice Green's explosive testimony. Zora sat in the back with Tanya and Darnell, the weight of what had just been revealed pressing down on her chest. The room felt colder than usual now, the reality of the corruption they were uncovering settling in like a heavy fog. They hadn't just been fighting for the truth about Gregory Monroe's death, they had just cracked open a massive web of deceit, and Zora wasn't sure how far it stretched. Zora's mind raced. Karen Bailey didn't act alone. There had to be someone else, someone higher up who had been pulling the strings. Janice's testimony had shown that Karen had been part of a network, but that network was still a mystery. Who else was involved? She knew they needed to find out. Fast. Later that afternoon, Tanya and Zora sat in their small kitchen, the table cluttered with papers. Tanya had her head in her hands, exhaustion from the past few days etched into every line of her face. She had been the pillar, holding them all together, but even she couldn't deny the toll this was taking. Darnell was the one who kept pushing forward, his gaze fixed on the pile of documents spread out before them. He had been going over the records, cross-referencing every name, every phone number, every address that might connect to Karen Bailey's past. "I've got something," Darnell said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. He slid a document across the table. It was a list of names, a roster of high-ranking officials at St. Vincent's Medical Center, some of whom Zora recognized, some she didn't. But one name stood out like a beacon, Dr. Thomas Harris. "Who's this?" Zora asked, leaning over to look more closely. Dr. Harris was the medical director of the hospital. "He's been in charge of everything for the past 5 years, Darnell said, tapping the name with his finger. "It seems like he and Karen Bailey have been working together for a long time. And get this, Dr. Harris was one of the people who signed off on Gregory Monroe's medical records. Along with Karen." Zora's pulse quickened. "So, you're saying Harris is part of this?" "I'm not saying it for sure, but the connections are hard to ignore," Darnell replied. "Look, there's more. Karen Bailey's name keeps popping up alongside Dr. Harris's on nearly every major decision regarding the hospital's internal investigations. Every time there's a malpractice case or a potential lawsuit, their names are listed as key figures in the decision-making process." Zora stared at the papers in front of her, her thoughts swirling. Dr. Harris. Of course. The director. He had the power, the influence. But why hadn't anyone pointed to him before? They needed more than just names. They needed proof. The next day, Zora's phone buzzed as they sat in the living room. It was an encrypted message from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously. "I know what you're looking for. I can help, but you need to be careful. Harris isn't the only one you need to worry about. There are bigger players involved, and they've been watching you. Meet me tonight at 9. I'll tell you everything you need to know." Zora felt a chill run down her spine. It was one thing to hear rumors, to suspect that things were off, but this was different. Whoever this person was, they knew too much. "Who's it from?" Tanya asked, noticing Zora's tense expression. "I don't know," Zora said, showing her the message. "But they say they know what we're looking for. They want to meet tonight." Tanya's face darkened. "It sounds like a trap." "I don't think so," Zora said, her voice quieter. "If they're offering information, it means they want to help. We can't back down now." That night, under the cover of darkness, Zora and Tanya drove to the meeting spot, an abandoned coffee shop on the outskirts of town. The area was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Zora felt a nervous knot in her stomach, but she pushed the fear aside. This could be the break they needed. When they arrived, Zora parked the car, and they stepped out cautiously. They walked toward the entrance, where a lone figure stood near the door. It was a man, his face partially obscured by a hood. He looked up as they approached. "You're the ones looking for answers," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes," Zora said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to know what happened. What's really going on with Karen Bailey and Dr. Harris?" The man hesitated before speaking again. It's not just them. There's a whole network, a group of powerful people connected to St. Vincent's. Harris and Bailey are just the tip of the iceberg. They've been covering up malpractice, altering records, and silencing anyone who threatens to expose them. You've got to be careful, there are people watching, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. Zora's mind was racing. Who are they? Who's behind all of this? The man shook his head, glancing around nervously. I can't tell you everything right now. But I can give you a lead. Look into a company called Mosaic Health Systems. They're the ones funding everything. They have connections to the board at St. Vincent's and they've been pulling the strings for years. If you want to get to the bottom of this, that's where you start. Zora's heart sank. Mosaic Health Systems. The name meant nothing to her, but something about the way the man said it made her feel like they were about to uncover a much larger conspiracy than they could have imagined. We need more than just names, Tanya said, her voice sharp. We need proof. We need something that ties them together. The man nodded. You'll find it. But you have to be careful. If you push too hard, they'll come for you. They'll come for all of you. He turned and began to walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. As they drove back home, Zora's mind spun with the new information. Mosaic Health Systems. Who were they? What did they have to do with the cover-up? One thing was clear, they were getting closer to the truth. But the closer they got, the more dangerous things would become. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days felt like a blur. Zora and Tanya spent every waking moment diving deeper into the mystery surrounding Mosaic Health Systems. Darnell helped as much as he could, but his attention was split between the research and his responsibilities at work. Zora couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something bigger, something dangerous. Mosaic Health Systems, Zora murmured, her eyes scanning the small whiteboard in front of her. She had written the name several times, underlined it with red, and connected it to the names of Dr. Harris and Karen Bailey. But there was still so much they didn't know. What's their connection to the hospital? Tanya stood at the kitchen counter, going through a stack of papers that had arrived earlier in the day. It's like they don't even exist until you dig deeper, she said, frustration in her voice. There's nothing on the surface. No clear information. No public record of any wrongdoing. It's all hidden. Zora sat down next to Tanya, feeling the weight of the silence that had settled between them. The fact that Mosaic Health Systems had no clear public presence was unsettling. They had to be hiding something. Zora leaned back, rubbing her temples. She had a headache from the endless research and the constant stream of revelations. But one thing she was sure of, whoever had created this system had designed it carefully. And now, she had to find a way to dismantle it. That evening, Darnell came over with a box full of documents. He plopped it down on the table, his face grim. I've got some stuff you'll want to see, he said, his voice low. It's not just a healthcare corporation. Mosaic Health Systems is a conglomerate. They own half a dozen major hospitals across the state. And the Hospital Board of St. Vincent's? It's practically controlled by them. Zora's eyes widened. Controlled by them? Yep, Darnell replied, sifting through the documents. According to these financial records, Mosaic Health Systems has been behind most of the hospital's decisions for years. They fund the board members' salaries, make sure the board members are aligned with their interests, and those interests don't exactly align with patient care. Are you saying they're controlling the hospital? Tanya asked, incredulity in her voice. Darnell nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. This isn't just about Gregory Monroe or Karen Bailey. This is about a whole system that's designed to cover up malpractice, ignore patient rights, and protect their own pockets. Zora felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. This was worse than she had imagined. They weren't just dealing with a couple of bad actors, they were facing an entire system designed to abuse its power. She glanced at Tanya, whose expression had darkened. "Where do we go from here?" Tanya asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Zora replied. "But we can't stop now. We've got to find a way to get the truth out. People need to know what's happening." The following day, Zora decided to reach out to the local news. She had been reluctant at first, worried about the potential backlash, the danger that could come with going public. But as the days passed, the fear that had once paralyzed her turned into something else, determination. She spent hours researching journalists in the area who had written about the hospital and healthcare issues in general. She narrowed it down to a reporter named Laura Mitchell, who had done several stories about medical malpractice and hospital corruption in the past. Zora sent her an encrypted email, outlining everything they had uncovered so far. To her surprise, the response came quickly. "I want to meet with you. I believe you're onto something big. Meet me at the diner on West Pine Street tonight at 7. Zora felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. This was it. They were moving closer to getting the story out. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized they were taking a huge risk. If anyone, especially Mosaic Health Systems, found out, they could destroy everything. That night, Zora and Tanya sat in the corner booth of the diner, their eyes scanning the room every few seconds. It wasn't a fancy place, but the quiet atmosphere provided a sense of security. When the door opened, a woman stepped in, scanning the room. Zora recognized her from the profile picture she had found online. Laura Mitchell was in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of purpose. She walked over to their booth without hesitation and slid into the seat across from Zora. "You must be Zora," Laura said, extending her hand. Zora shook it firmly. "And this is Tanya." "I know who you are," Laura said, giving Tanya a small smile. "I've been following your story for a while now. But I didn't think it was going to be this big." "What do you mean?" Tanya asked, narrowing her eyes. Laura leaned forward, lowering her voice. "What you've uncovered goes way beyond a couple of corrupt nurses. Mosaic Health Systems is involved in a massive money laundering scheme. They're funneling millions of dollars through St. Vincent's and other hospitals they control. But it's not just about the money. They've been buying political influence, silencing whistleblowers, and using their hospitals as cover for illegal activities." Zora's mind reeled. Money laundering? Political influence? It was worse than she could have imagined. Why hasn't anyone exposed this before? Zora asked, trying to process everything Laura had said. Laura glanced around the diner, making sure no one was listening. Because anyone who tries ends up disappearing, or worse, gets labeled as a fraud. They've covered their tracks too well. But you have something they don't, you have the truth. Zora felt a sense of clarity in that moment. The truth. That's what she had. That's what could take this entire system down. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be without risks. But they had to keep going. "We need your help," Zora said, her voice steady. "We have documents. We have the proof. But we can't do this alone. We need the media to back us up. We need to expose this before it's too late." Laura nodded, her expression serious. "I'm in. But we need to act fast. Once they know we're onto them, they'll come after you." Zora looked at Tanya, then back at Laura. This was it. The fight had just gotten real, and there was no turning back now. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Zora and Tanya, with Laura's help, scrambled to gather as much evidence as possible. They knew that exposing Mosaic Health Systems would be like poking a hornet's nest. But the truth had to come out. They couldn't stop now. Laura had made some crucial contacts in the media, and soon they had a plan to leak the story. The evidence they had, financial records, emails, and testimonies, would be enough to make a splash, but they needed more. Zora's mind raced as they brainstormed the next steps. Time was running out, and they had to move quickly before Mosaic's operatives could stop them. It was late one evening when the tension in the air felt palpable. Zora sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the documents and files they had gathered. Tanya sat across from her, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring at the papers with an intensity that matched Zora's own. "We can't wait much longer," Tanya said quietly. "The longer we sit on this, the more they'll get away with. And the more dangerous it gets for us." Zora nodded. The fear that had gripped her when she first started this investigation was no longer the dominant feeling. Now, it was determination. They had come too far to back down. "I know," she said. "We need to make sure we have everything. Once we leak this, there's no going back." As she spoke, her phone buzzed on the table. Zora picked it up, her heart pounding as she read the message from Laura. "It's time. We're ready. The press conference is set. We go live in 48 hours. The message hit Zora like a punch to the gut. This was it. They were about to make the biggest move of their lives. The countdown had begun. The following day, the three women met in a small, unmarked office that Laura had rented for the purpose of organizing the release of the information. They sat in front of multiple laptops, each screen filled with files, records, and contacts. Every moment felt urgent, like a clock was ticking louder and louder in their ears. "I've contacted the journalists and TV stations who will broadcast the story," Laura said, her voice steady. "We're going to break the story on prime time. There's no way Mosaic can silence this. We've got everything we need." Zora glanced at Tanya, who gave a small, but determined nod. "What about the safety? Are we sure we're covered?" Laura met her gaze. "We'll be fine. I've made arrangements. The moment we release the information, it's in the public's hands. There's no way they can stop the press. But we need to be prepared for anything. They won't go down without a fight." Zora swallowed hard. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next." As the hours ticked by, they prepared for the conference. It wasn't just the documents they had to make sure were in order, it was the emotional toll this was taking on all of them. Zora couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't control. It was late at night when Laura received another message. This time, it wasn't from a contact or a reporter, it was a warning. "You've gone too far. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. You know who's behind Mosaic." Zora's stomach dropped as she read the words. The message was clear: someone was watching them. Someone who had the power to make them disappear if they pushed too hard. Laura read the message over Zora's shoulder, her face hardening. "They're on to us," she said quietly. "But we can't back down now. If we stop, we're handing them a victory. We have to keep going." The next day, as the clock counted down to the press conference, Zora couldn't stop thinking about the threats. They were no longer just words on a screen, they were a reality. Mosaic Health Systems wasn't going to let them expose the truth without a fight. Zora paced in the small office, her mind racing. She had always been the calm, collected one. But now, she was starting to feel the weight of what they were doing. The stakes had never been higher. "I can't stop thinking about what they said," Zora admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "What if they come after us? What if they hurt someone we love?" Tanya reached out and placed a reassuring hand on Zora's shoulder. "We've come this far," she said firmly. "We've uncovered the truth. There's no going back now. We're in this together, no matter what happens." Zora nodded, drawing strength from her friend's words. "You're right. We can't let them intimidate us. We've got the truth on our side." Later that afternoon, as the press conference drew closer, Zora, Tanya, and Laura met one final time before the storm hit. Zora looked at them both, taking a deep breath. "We've got everything we need," she said. "This is the moment. It's now or never." Laura smiled. "We've already won by getting this far. Exposing them is just the final step." As night fell, the press conference was set into motion. Zora sat in front of the camera, her heart pounding in her chest. Tanya was behind the scenes, coordinating with reporters, while Laura stood by, ready to release the information to the world. "This is it," Zora whispered to herself, staring into the camera. "We're about to change everything." The air was thick with anticipation as Zora sat in front of the camera, the flashing lights illuminating her face. The press conference was live, broadcasted to millions of viewers, and in a matter of moments, the truth that had been hidden for so long would be exposed to the world. The weight of the moment felt like 1,000 pounds on her shoulders, but she refused to back down. She couldn't. Behind her, Tanya was busy checking her phone, making sure the reporters were all set, while Laura hovered near the door, ready to step in at any moment if things went awry. "This is it," Zora murmured to herself, her heart pounding. She had always been an advocate for truth and justice, but now she was standing on the edge of something bigger than herself. Mosaic Health Systems, the corporation that had evaded scrutiny for so long, was about to be torn apart, and Zora was the one holding the hammer. At exactly 7 p.m., the countdown clock on the screen hit 0. Zora took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "Good evening," Zora began, her words clear and strong. "My name is Zora Monroe, and today, I stand before you to tell the truth, a truth that has been hidden for far too long." She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the sea of reporters in front of her. Every camera in the room seemed to focus on her, amplifying the magnitude of what she was about to say. "For the past several months, I've been investigating Mosaic Health Systems, a conglomerate that controls several major hospitals across the state, including St. Vincent's Medical Center. What I have uncovered is nothing short of shocking. It's a web of corruption, malpractice, and illegal activities, all designed to line the pockets of those in power, while the patients they're supposed to care for are left to suffer." Zora felt a surge of adrenaline as she spoke. She wasn't just reading from a script, this was her truth. The pain, the frustration, the anger, all of it poured into her voice. Mosaic Health Systems has been using its influence to manipulate the healthcare system, putting profits above people's lives. They've been funneling millions of dollars through their hospitals, engaging in money laundering schemes, bribing public officials, and silencing anyone who tries to stand in their way. The room was silent. Every eye was on her, every camera trained on her face. She continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I've seen the evidence. The financial records, the emails, the testimonies from former employees and patients. Mosaic Health Systems has been running a racket for years. And it's not just about money. It's about power. It's about control. It's about keeping the truth buried so deep that no one dares to question them." Zora took a breath, feeling her heart race. This was the moment that would change everything. The truth was no longer in her hands, it was in the hands of everyone who was watching. As she spoke, Tanya and Laura exchanged tense glances. They could see that Zora was holding strong, but they both knew that once the story broke, there would be no going back. Mosaic had too much power, too many connections, and they wouldn't let it go without a fight. Laura whispered, "We have to be ready. They'll come after us. We need to make sure this information gets out, no matter what." Tanya nodded, her jaw clenched. "I know. We've come too far to back down now." Zora continued her address, the pressure building. "But the fight doesn't stop here. This isn't just about exposing corruption, it's about justice. It's about accountability. It's about demanding that healthcare systems prioritize people over profit. The victims of Mosaic are not just numbers, they are real people with families, with lives that matter." Her words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, the room felt still, like the calm before a storm. Zora knew that the storm was coming, and there was no way to avoid it now. As soon as the press conference ended, the room erupted into a frenzy. Journalists shouted questions, reporters scrambled to capture every word Zora had said, and cameras flashed from every direction. The next few minutes felt like hours as Zora, Tanya, and Laura tried to navigate through the chaos. "This is just the beginning," Laura said, her eyes narrowed. "Now we need to make sure this story goes viral. We need the world to know what's really going on behind closed doors." Zora nodded. "We have to keep pushing. We can't let them bury this." But as the adrenaline started to wear off, reality set in. Zora, Tanya, and Laura knew they couldn't rest, not for a second. They were in the middle of a fight against an empire. And empires didn't fall easily. Later that night, as they huddled together in the small office, the phone rang. Zora hesitated before answering, her pulse racing as she saw an unknown number on the screen. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. Zora Monroe, a deep, gravelly voice responded. "You've made a big mistake. You've played your hand, and now you'll pay the price. We will not let this go. You think you can take down Mosaic Health Systems? You're delusional." The voice on the other end was cold, calculated, and filled with venom. Zora's stomach churned, but she held her ground. "If you think I'm going to back down, you don't know me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that crept in. "The truth is out now. You can't stop it." The voice laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound. "We'll see about that. This is far from over." With that, the call ended. Zora sat there, staring at the phone in her hand, as the gravity of the situation hit her all over again. They were no longer just dealing with corruption, they were dealing with something far darker. Mosaic Health Systems would stop at nothing to protect their empire, and Zora knew that now, more than ever, they were in real danger. The next few days after the press conference felt like living on a razor's edge. Zora, Tanya, and Laura went from the high of exposing the truth to the crushing weight of realizing just how dangerous their situation had become. The phone call from that night still echoed in Zora's mind. "You think you can take down Mosaic Health Systems? You're delusional." The chilling words haunted her as she tried to sleep, the darkness outside feeling like a silent witness to the threat they were facing. Zora sat at her desk, her mind racing as she stared at the stack of evidence in front of her. The information they had released was out there, but Mosaic wasn't letting it go quietly. Their lawyers were already firing back, trying to discredit the reports, spinning lies in the media to tarnish Zora's credibility. The battle for the truth had only just begun, and Zora knew the stakes had been raised higher than ever. Tanya was pacing the room, frustration written all over her face. "We knew they wouldn't sit back and let this slide, but it's getting worse. Every news outlet is being bombarded with their spin. We need to hit back harder." Zora rubbed her temples, exhaustion weighing her down. "I know, but we can't keep up with this on our own. We need more people on our side, more media, more whistleblowers, more proof. But how do we even get there with Mosaic already working to destroy us?" Laura entered the room, her face serious. "I've been talking to some of my contacts. It's not just the media spinning this, we're talking about a full-blown smear campaign. They've already started digging into your past, Zora. They're trying to make you look like a fraud." Zora's heart sank. "What are they saying?" "They're going after your credibility," Laura said grimly. "Trying to make it seem like you have an agenda, that you're just trying to make a name for yourself. They've even started questioning your motives, accusing you of being a part of some kind of political plot to destroy Mosaic." Zora felt a pang of anger but quickly suppressed it. "It's not going to work. I'm telling the truth." Tanya stopped pacing and turned toward Zora. "It's not about the truth anymore, Zora. They have the power to shape the narrative. And if we don't hit them harder, we're going to lose this fight." The room fell into silence. Zora's thoughts whirled as she tried to process the new information. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but the magnitude of what they were up against was becoming clearer by the day. It wasn't just about fighting corruption anymore, it was about surviving the war that Mosaic was waging against them. The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, phone calls with reporters, and frantic attempts to find more evidence to back up their claims. But even as they worked tirelessly, they could feel the walls closing in. The phone call from the night of the press conference had been a warning, but it wasn't the last. Soon, Zora started receiving more messages that made her blood run cold. "You've made your point. Now it's time to pay the price. We're watching you. You won't get away with this." The text messages came from unknown numbers, and there were no clues as to who might be behind them. But Zora knew deep down that it was no coincidence. Mosaic Health Systems wasn't just a corporation, it was a behemoth with tentacles everywhere, and they had the resources to make people disappear. One evening, as Zora returned to her apartment after another exhausting day of meetings, she noticed something strange. Her front door was slightly ajar, and her heart skipped a beat. She had locked it before she left. Slowly, she pushed the door open, every sense on high alert. The silence inside her apartment was deafening. "Hello?" Zora called out, her voice tight with fear. She stepped inside, cautiously, eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the feeling of unease gnawed at her. Her eyes fell on the small desk in the corner of the room. There, on top of a pile of papers, was a single black envelope. Her pulse quickened as she walked toward it. There was no return address, no markings, just the sealed envelope staring back at her. With trembling fingers, Zora ripped it open and pulled out the contents. It was a single piece of paper with one short sentence written in bold, capital letters. "Stop or else." Her breath caught in her throat. The message was clear. Someone knew where she lived, and they were warning her to back off before things escalated even further. She didn't have to think twice. She knew the stakes. She wasn't going to back down. But as Zora stood there, staring at the ominous message, a realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This was no longer just about exposing the truth. This was about survival. The next day, Zora met with Tanya and Laura to discuss their next move. Their faces were etched with concern, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. "We need to go public with the threats," Tanya suggested, her voice firm. "If we show the world that they're trying to intimidate us, it'll only make our case stronger. We can't let them silence us." Laura nodded. "But we have to be careful. We're already a target. If we go public with the threats, we'll make ourselves even more vulnerable." Zora rubbed her temples, feeling the strain of the decision before her. "But if we don't expose them, they'll think they can just walk all over us. We need to push back harder, to show that we won't back down." Tanya leaned forward, her expression resolute. "Then we need to take the fight to them. The media's already on our side. We go public, and we make sure that everyone knows who they're dealing with." Zora looked at her two best friends, both of whom had stuck by her through everything. They were in this together, no matter what happened. "We do it," Zora said, her voice unwavering. "We're taking the fight to Mosaic. No turning back now." The decision to go public with the threats was not an easy one. As Zora, Tanya, and Laura sat around the table, staring at the stack of papers, it was clear that the path ahead was fraught with danger. But Zora knew there was no turning back. If she didn't fight back now, the silence would only let Mosaic's corruption grow stronger. They had already taken enough from people, they couldn't let it continue. "I think we should start by getting the story out through an independent journalist," Tanya said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need someone who can connect the dots between the threats and Mosaic. But we can't go through mainstream media just yet. It's too risky." Zora nodded, her mind racing. "The public needs to know who we're up against. And we need to show them that we're not afraid." Laura was silent for a moment before speaking up. We also need to start reaching out to people who have been hurt by Mosaic. The employees, the patients. If we can gather more voices, it'll add weight to everything we're saying. We can't do this alone. Zora agreed, feeling a surge of determination. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was the fight of anyone who had been harmed by the system. And they were going to make sure their voices were heard. Later that week, they arranged a private meeting with a reporter named Emily Tran, a respected journalist who had done in-depth investigations on corporate corruption in the past. Emily was smart, cautious, and had a reputation for not backing down from powerful adversaries. She had a reputation for telling the truth, no matter the cost, which was exactly what Zora needed. They met at a small cafe on the edge of the city. Emily arrived early, scanning the room before approaching their table. Her sharp eyes took in the trio of women, sensing the weight of the situation. She didn't ask questions at first. Instead, she sat down and simply nodded for Zora to begin. Emily, we need to expose something big. Mosaic Health Systems is a corporate giant, but behind their shiny exterior, they're a corrupt, dangerous organization, Zora began, her voice low but unwavering. Emily leaned forward, her eyes alert. Go on. I've been gathering evidence for months now, Zora continued. And I've received threats to stop my investigation. But I can't stop. I need your help to make sure the world knows what's really going on. Zora pulled out a folder filled with documents, financial records, emails, and witness statements. As she placed it on the table, Emily began to sift through it, her brows furrowing as she flipped through the pages. The more she read, the more her expression hardened. This is huge, Emily said softly. This is not just corporate negligence. This is criminal. Zora nodded grimly. That's what we've been trying to tell everyone. But the media won't pick it up. They're too afraid of Mosaic's influence. Emily's eyes met Zora's. That's because they're scared. But this will change everything. If we go public with this, they won't be able to ignore us. Tanya leaned in. But it's not just about the truth. We're being hunted now. Mosaic won't just let this slide. Emily met her gaze and smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. I've taken on corporations like this before. Trust me, they won't scare me. A few days later, Emily's investigation broke in a small, independent media outlet. It wasn't a major network, but that didn't matter. The truth was out, and the public reaction was immediate. The articles exposed the breadth of Mosaic's corruption, the falsified medical records, the illegal kickbacks to hospitals, the manipulation of medical procedures for profit. There was no denying it now. Mosaic's empire was beginning to crumble. But with every victory came a new challenge. As soon as the first wave of media reports hit, the smear campaign against Zora and her team grew even more vicious. Anonymous social media accounts began posting false information, accusing Zora of fabricating evidence, and even claiming that she was part of a political conspiracy. At first, it was just rumors, but the more they spread, the more dangerous they became. One night, Zora received another ominous message. You've crossed the line. Stop, or you will regret it. Zora's hands trembled as she read the message. The threats were becoming more direct, and more personal. They weren't just trying to intimidate her anymore, they were sending a clear message: stop, or we'll make sure you regret it. The pressure was mounting, but Zora wasn't backing down. The truth was on her side, and she had come too far to let fear dictate her actions. With the evidence in the public eye, more whistleblowers began to step forward. Former employees of Mosaic, patients whose lives had been ruined by the healthcare system, and even some insiders who had been too afraid to speak before, all of them began reaching out to Zora, confirming her findings and adding more layers to the investigation. By the end of the week, another bombshell dropped. A former high-ranking executive from Mosaic named Greg Mullins came forward, offering explosive testimony about the company's internal operations. He revealed how Mosaic had been engaging in illegal practices for years, covering up deaths caused by mismanagement, and even manipulating health insurance claims to maximize profits. Greg's testimony was the final piece that Zora had been waiting for. But even as the walls around Mosaic began to shake, they still had power, and they weren't going to let Zora and her team off easily. Zora sat with Tanya and Laura that evening, going over the latest developments. They were closer than ever to winning this fight, but they also knew that the most dangerous part of the battle was just beginning. "We're not out of the woods yet," Laura said quietly. "They're going to fight back. Harder than ever." Zora nodded. "I know. But this is bigger than just us. We're fighting for everyone who's been hurt by Mosaic. And we're not stopping until they get the justice they deserve." Tanya placed a hand on Zora's shoulder, her voice steady. "We'll finish this together." And together, they would. The quiet that followed the public release of the investigation felt surreal. For the first time in weeks, Zora could breathe, even if just for a moment. It was as if the world had finally begun to listen, and that was enough to give her a fleeting sense of peace. The media coverage had exploded in a way they hadn't expected, and Mosaic Health Systems was under siege. For a few brief days, Zora and her team allowed themselves to savor the victory, at least the part where the truth was out there. Mosaic was scrambling, their carefully crafted image now tarnished by the revelations that had hit the media like a bomb. The executives were on defensive, making half-hearted attempts to deny the allegations, but it was clear that the walls were crumbling around them. But Zora knew the calm wouldn't last. Mosaic wasn't going to roll over. No corporation this large and powerful ever did. The truth might be on their side, but they were facing an enemy that wouldn't stop fighting until they were silenced. And the worst part was, Zora couldn't be sure they wouldn't succeed. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across Zora's apartment, she felt the weight of the coming storm pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up, glancing at the text message from Tanya. "We need to talk. Something's coming." Zora's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this. Even though they had just made significant progress, she knew it was only a matter of time before Mosaic struck back. They weren't the type to give up without a fight. She quickly texted back, "I'll be there in 30 minutes." When Zora arrived at Tanya's apartment, she was greeted by the sight of her best friend pacing anxiously around the room. Laura was sitting at the kitchen table, her face grim. The air in the room was thick with tension. "What's going on?" Zora asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. Tanya turned toward her, her face pale. "We've just received word from our sources. Mosaic has hired a new team of crisis management experts, and they're coming after us in a big way. They've already been reaching out to some of our contacts, trying to discredit us." Zora's stomach tightened. "How bad is it?" "It's bad," Laura said quietly, her eyes scanning a series of documents on the table. "I've been looking through some of the data we've collected, and there's a pattern emerging. Mosaic isn't just trying to cover up their crimes, they're going after people. They're trying to silence whistleblowers, intimidate the media, and they're using their power to ruin lives. They've started threatening not just us, but anyone who's helped us." Zora's blood ran cold. She had known it was coming, but hearing it laid out like this made it all too real. Mosaic wasn't just trying to save their reputation, they were going to war. Tanya slammed her fist on the table, frustration evident in her eyes. "They're going to do whatever it takes to shut us down, Zora. They won't just play fair. They'll go after our families, our careers, everything." Zora stood still, processing the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was about survival. "We can't back down," Zora said, her voice firm. "We've come too far. If we give up now, Mosaic wins. But if we fight back, even if it's messy, there's a chance we can make them pay for what they've done." Laura stood up, meeting Zora's gaze. "We have no choice but to go forward. But we need to be prepared. If we're going to expose Mosaic and everything they've done, we need a full-on public strategy. We need to start building an even bigger network of people to come forward, whistleblowers, experts, patients, anyone who can back up the facts we're putting out there. Tanya nodded in agreement. We need to hit them where it hurts. The more people we can rally behind us, the stronger we'll be. The next few days felt like a blur of meetings and phone calls. Zora's team worked tirelessly to collect even more evidence and to start organizing their public strategy. They reached out to journalists, legal experts, and advocates, building a network of support that would ensure their message would be heard. But with every step they took forward, the shadow of Mosaic loomed closer, and they knew it wouldn't be long before the next attack came. Late one night, as Zora sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. Zora's heart pounded in her chest as she picked up. Zora, a voice on the other end said, low and urgent. You don't know me, but I've worked with Mosaic for years. I have information that can help you. They're about to make their next move, and it's going to hit you harder than anything you've seen so far. Zora's pulse quickened. Who is this? I can't say my name, the voice said quickly. But you need to act fast. They're going to file a lawsuit against you and your team, accusing you of defamation, fraud, and conspiracy. They'll try to bankrupt you. They're going to ruin your lives if you don't stop. Zora's mind raced. This was exactly what she had feared, the next phase of the war. But this could be their chance to get ahead of Mosaic's next move. What do I need to do? She asked. The voice hesitated for a moment. I'll send you everything I have. But you need to be ready. The storm is coming, Zora. You've been warned. Before Zora could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, heart racing, her mind already planning her next move. The following morning, Zora met with Tanya and Laura to brief them on the call. They're coming for us, Zora said, her voice tight with determination. But we're not backing down. We've got more proof, and we're not afraid to use it. Laura placed her hand on the table, her eyes filled with resolve. We're in this together. No matter what happens next, we're not going to let Mosaic win. Tanya nodded, a fierce glint in her eyes. Let them come. We're ready. Zora took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was ahead of them. The calm was over. The storm was coming, and it was going to be worse than anything they had faced so far. But Zora was ready to face it. She had no choice. The days after the call from the mysterious whistleblower felt like a countdown to a battle Zora wasn't sure she could win. She had always known this fight would be difficult, but now, it was no longer a question of truth, it was about survival. The next morning, Tanya, Laura, and Zora sat around the kitchen table, their eyes focused on the documents spread before them. Each page was a lifeline, but also a reminder of how much they had at stake. In the top corner of each sheet, the familiar Mosaic Health Systems logo mocked them, a constant reminder that the giant they were fighting had power, influence, and the resources to crush them. We've got a few things working in our favor, Laura said, tapping a stack of papers. First, we have all the whistleblower statements and evidence. Second, we've managed to gain traction with smaller news outlets. If we push hard enough, we might be able to make this a national story. But, she trailed off, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. But? Zora pressed. But now that Mosaic has filed their lawsuit, they're going to come after us full force. The legal team they've hired is one of the best in the country. They're going to use every trick in the book to discredit us, Laura continued. We need to be prepared for a war on all fronts. Zora leaned back in her chair, her eyes steely with determination. I knew this was coming. I just didn't expect it to come this fast. But we're not backing down. We've exposed the truth, and that's more than they've ever had to face. We need to keep pushing. Tanya nodded. They're going to drag this through the courts for as long as they can. But we've got one thing they don't, the truth. If we keep getting the word out, if we keep the pressure on, we can't lose. Days turned into weeks, and the legal battle began to unfold in ways Zora hadn't anticipated. Mosaic's legal team was relentless. They filed motion after motion, accusing Zora and her team of defamation, conspiracy, and spreading misinformation. They even went so far as to subpoena private records and try to get their hands on any information they could use against her. The news cycle shifted as well. While Mosaic continued to maintain their denial of all allegations, they began to unleash a coordinated smear campaign. Social media flooded with posts accusing Zora and her team of being politically motivated, suggesting that their investigation was a setup to damage Mosaic's reputation for reasons other than truth. Every day, there was a new headline questioning their integrity, a new wave of accusations. But with every new attempt to silence them, Zora only became more resolute. The smear campaign, though painful, didn't deter her. Instead, it pushed her further into the fight. She had nothing to hide. The facts were on her side, and she couldn't let them bury the truth. One evening, Zora was sitting at her desk, reviewing the latest court documents, when her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Emily Tran, the investigative journalist who had been working with them. "I've got something big. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. Zora felt a rush of adrenaline. She had learned to trust Emily, she had always been a step ahead in the investigation. If Emily had something new, it could be just the breakthrough they needed. The next morning, Zora met Emily at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The usual hustle of the cafe was subdued today, as if the world knew something was coming. Emily was already there, sitting in the corner with a thick manila envelope. "Zora, I've got something," Emily said, her voice low but urgent. "It's a smoking gun. This could change everything." Zora sat down, her heart racing. "What is it?" Emily slid the envelope across the table. "It's a recording. One of Mosaic's top executives talking about covering up deaths. I got it from a source inside the company. They're worried now. This is their biggest secret." Zora opened the envelope and pulled out a USB drive. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted it into her laptop. The recording played, and Zora's blood ran cold. The voice on the recording was unmistakable, Greg Mullins, the same executive who had come forward with testimony earlier. But this time, it wasn't the same tale of negligence. This was worse. "We can't let this get out," Mullins' voice said, his tone dark. "We can't let anyone find out what we've done. Those patients, what happened to them, has to stay buried. If it gets out, it'll destroy us. All of us." The recording continued, detailing how Mosaic had covered up multiple incidents where patients had died due to mismanagement or neglect. It was a revelation that went far beyond the fraud and kickbacks. They had been deliberately hiding deaths in order to maintain their profits. Zora's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. This was the proof they needed to take Mosaic down once and for all. She looked up at Emily, a sense of determination in her eyes. "This is going to end them." Emily nodded. "We've got one shot at this. If we release this, there's no turning back. Mosaic will do everything they can to destroy us." Zora closed her laptop, her mind racing. "It's already happening. They're already trying to destroy us. We release this, we don't just expose their lies, we end the company. We can't let them get away with this anymore." Back at the apartment, Zora, Tanya, and Laura gathered once again. They had a decision to make. "This is it," Zora said, her voice filled with resolve. "We've got the smoking gun. We're going to release it to the public." Tanya looked at her, a mixture of fear and pride in her eyes. "We've been preparing for this moment, haven't we?" "We have," Zora said. "And we're not stopping now." Laura stood up, her fists clenched. "This is bigger than just us. This is for every single person who's ever been hurt by Mosaic. We can't turn back. They all knew the risks. Mosaic was a giant, and giants didn't fall easily. But they had the truth. And for the first time in weeks, Zora felt a surge of hope. This could be the moment that changed everything. The next day, the recording was released to the public. It hit the media like a bombshell. The public reaction was immediate: outrage, shock, and disbelief spread like wildfire. People couldn't believe the depths of Mosaic's corruption. But just as quickly, the response from Mosaic was just as intense. Their legal team fired off threats, demanding the immediate removal of the video, claiming it was doctored and part of a larger conspiracy. Zora knew they were in for the fight of their lives. But they had taken the first step toward justice, and they weren't going to stop now. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke. The release of the Mosaic executive's damning recording had set off a chain reaction unlike anything Zora and her team had anticipated. The media had gone wild, with news outlets and social media blowing up with the shocking details of the company's deliberate cover-up of patient deaths. But with every victory came a new battle. "We need to prepare for their next move," Tanya had said that morning, her voice tense as she looked through the flood of messages and news reports. "Mosaic is coming after us in every direction now. The public's outrage is only going to fuel their counterattack." Zora knew Tanya was right. The battle had escalated. The legal threats had turned into full-on legal action. Mosaic had filed a new wave of lawsuits, this time accusing Zora and her team of illegal surveillance, hacking, and extortion. The charges were baseless, but their purpose was clear: to intimidate and break their spirits. "This is war," Laura said quietly, glancing at the latest legal filings. "We've been prepared for this. They can sue us, they can threaten us, but they can't bury the truth." The pressure was mounting on every side. Zora's phone buzzed constantly with calls from journalists, whistleblowers, and their growing network of supporters. But there was another, more urgent message waiting for her in her inbox: an invitation to a meeting at the courthouse. It wasn't just any meeting. It was the pretrial hearing. The day of the hearing arrived faster than Zora could have anticipated. It felt like a dream, like everything she had fought for was culminating in this one moment. But it also felt like a nightmare. The weight of what was at stake pressed down on her. Mosaic's lawyers had hired a top-tier legal team, a group known for their ruthlessness. Their tactics were not about justice, they were about winning, no matter the cost. Zora sat in the quiet waiting room of the courthouse, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Tanya and Laura were there too, as always. They had become more than just colleagues, they were a team, a family. And today, they were all in this together. As the doors to the courtroom opened, Zora felt the heavy air of anticipation. She stood, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet as she walked toward the room. Every step felt like it was leading her closer to an uncertain future. The courtroom was filled with tension. Journalists were already lined up along the back, their cameras poised and ready. In the front row, Mosaic's executives sat with their high-powered lawyers. Greg Mullins, the man whose voice had been caught on the recording, was present as well. His gaze met Zora's briefly, but he quickly looked away, his face tight with anger. Zora took her seat at the front of the room, next to Tanya and Laura. They could all feel the eyes of the world upon them. This wasn't just a trial, it was the final confrontation. The hearing began, and the judge, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair, called the room to order. "This is a pretrial hearing to address the motions filed by both the plaintiffs and the defendants. We will hear from both sides and then determine the next steps." Zora's lawyer, Marissa, stood and addressed the court with confidence. "Your Honor, we are here today because Mosaic Health Systems has attempted to silence truth through threats, intimidation, and a coordinated smear campaign. What we have uncovered is not just corruption, it is criminal negligence. Our team has worked tirelessly to bring these facts to light, and we will not back down." The lawyer for Mosaic, a tall, sharply dressed man named Edward Dunsmore, rose to speak. His voice was smooth, calculated. "Your Honor, my clients are victims of a smear campaign. The claims against them are fabricated, based on doctored evidence, and driven by a group with a clear agenda to destroy a successful corporation. We request that all charges be dismissed immediately." Zora's stomach churned as Dunsmore continued, twisting the narrative in Mosaic's favor. Every word was designed to discredit them, to make them appear as nothing more than opportunists. She clenched her fists under the table. She had heard enough. She wasn't going to let them win this. After hours of arguments, the judge called for a brief recess. Zora, Tanya, and Laura huddled together in the hallway, discussing their next steps. "This is it, isn't it?" Tanya said, her voice shaking with both fear and resolve. "This is our chance to finish this." "We can't afford to back down," Zora replied, her gaze steely. "We've fought too hard to let them lie their way out of this. We've exposed their darkest secrets. Now we have to stand firm." But Zora could feel the weight of uncertainty creeping in. Mosaic was powerful. They had the money and the connections to make this go away. But they didn't have the truth. And that was the one thing Zora had. The court reconvened after the recess, and the judge began to make her ruling. The room grew silent, every person on edge, waiting for her decision. After hearing the arguments from both sides, the judge began, "It is clear that there is enough evidence to proceed with this case. The allegations against Mosaic Health Systems will be thoroughly examined in court. This case will go to trial." A wave of relief washed over Zora. They had won the first round. The truth would be heard, and Mosaic would not be able to silence them. But the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning of a long fight, one that would require all their strength and resilience. As Zora left the courthouse, she stepped out into the harsh sunlight, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, hope. The fight was far from over, but they had taken a crucial step forward. They had forced the truth into the open. And now, no matter what Mosaic did, the world would know the truth. Tanya and Laura stood beside her, their faces resolute. "We're not done yet," Zora said, her voice strong. "This is just the start. We have to finish this." The days leading up to the trial were a blur. The pressure was immense. Zora had never felt so close to a breaking point. Every part of her life, her work, her friends, her family, was consumed by this case. The media was still buzzing with the fallout from Mosaic's attempt to bury the truth, and their smear campaign had only grown more aggressive. They'd launched new attacks, questioning Zora's motivations, painting her as a villain and not a hero. But Zora wasn't listening. She couldn't afford to. Every night, she and her team would gather around the kitchen table, reviewing evidence, strategizing their next moves, and preparing for the moment when they'd finally face Mosaic in court. Tanya, Laura, and Zora had become more than just a team, they had become family. Their bond had only deepened through the fight, and as they prepared for the trial's final stretch, they knew they were ready. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom felt different this time. The weight of it all, of the evidence, the public attention, and the stakes, hung in the air. Zora could barely feel her legs beneath her as she walked into the courtroom. It was all too surreal, too overwhelming. But she couldn't falter now. She had to see this through. The judge entered the room, and the final hearing began. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with reporters, legal experts, and the people who had supported Zora all along. The tension was palpable. In the front row, Mosaic's top lawyers sat with their arms folded, their faces stern and unyielding. But Zora could see the cracks in their armor. This wasn't just another case for them. This was personal. They were fighting for everything they had built, and now, the truth was threatening to tear it all down. The proceedings began, and both sides presented their final arguments. Zora's lawyer, Marissa, spoke with fire and conviction. She laid out the case piece by piece, highlighting the overwhelming evidence they had uncovered, the whistleblower recordings, the medical records, the testimonies of those who had been harmed by Mosaic's negligence. Marissa didn't just speak for Zora, she spoke for all the victims, for all the lives lost in Mosaic's wake. On the other side, Mosaic's legal team tried to discredit the evidence, claiming it was obtained illegally and that the company had acted in good faith. Edward Dunsmore, the slick attorney who had been with Mosaic from the start, tried to sway the jury with his polished rhetoric, but Zora could see the desperation in his eyes. The cracks were widening. It was a battle of words, a clash of ideals. But the facts, the undeniable truth, were on Zora's side. And with every passing hour, the pressure on Mosaic grew. After what felt like an eternity, the judge called for a recess. Zora sat in the hallway, her mind racing, her thoughts colliding. She knew they had made their case, but there was still a terrifying uncertainty in the air. What would the jury decide? What would the judge rule? The break seemed like an eternity, but finally, the call came. The courtroom was full again. Zora's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to her seat. Her hands were cold, and she could feel her stomach twist in nervous anticipation. Tanya and Laura sat beside her, their eyes locked on her with silent support. The judge entered the room, and the silence was deafening. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both sides, and after careful deliberation, I have come to a decision," the judge announced, her voice calm but commanding. "This court has found that Mosaic Health Systems engaged in deliberate negligence, which resulted in harm and loss of life for multiple individuals. The actions taken by the defendant were not only irresponsible but criminal in nature. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs, Zora Williams and her legal team. Mosaic Health Systems will be held accountable for their actions." Zora felt as though the world had stopped turning. The words echoed in her ears. They had won. The truth had prevailed. A wave of relief, triumph, and disbelief flooded over her. She could hardly process it. She had been fighting for so long, enduring every setback, every challenge, and now, finally, they had brought Mosaic to justice. Tears welled up in Zora's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. This moment wasn't just hers. It was for every victim, every person who had been hurt by Mosaic's greed. She had done it. They had done it. Together, they had taken down a corporate giant. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Zora barely heard it. She stood slowly, her body shaking as she turned to face her team. Tanya and Laura were already there, their arms wrapped around her in a tight embrace. For a moment, they stood there, the weight of the victory sinking in. "We did it," Tanya whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Zora looked at her, then at Laura, and nodded. "We did it. We never gave up. And now, the world knows the truth." As Zora stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was setting on the horizon. The air was crisp, the sky painted with hues of pink and orange. It felt like a new beginning, like the end of one chapter and the start of another. The media was waiting outside, their cameras flashing, but Zora didn't feel the weight of their attention. She didn't need their approval. She had fought for something bigger than fame or recognition. She had fought for justice, for the people who had no voice, for those who had been silenced. And now, she had her answer. Months passed, and the fallout from the case continued. Mosaic was forced to pay substantial fines, and many of its top executives were charged with criminal negligence. The company's reputation, once untouchable, was shattered. The case became a landmark moment in the fight against corporate corruption, setting a precedent for future whistleblowers and activists. But Zora's journey wasn't over. She had become a symbol of resilience, a voice for those who had been overlooked and ignored. She began speaking at rallies, at conferences, and on panels. Her story inspired countless others to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. As Zora looked back on everything she had been through, she realized that it hadn't just been about taking down a corrupt corporation. It had been about reclaiming her own power, her own voice. She had learned that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. And as she looked ahead to the future, Zora knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. The fight for justice was never truly over. But for now, she had won. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?